All right, biology students, we are going to get started with Mendelian Genetics today. And I just want to express that if anything is written in red, that's one of your vocabulary words. So please make sure that that ends up in your notebook. So we're going to go through these slides, and then in class, we're going to do some practice problems together. So we talked a little bit about this already, that you kind of look like your parents, or that you have a certain physical look to you, so your height versus your hair texture versus your eye color. So all of these questions are going to be understood in the terms of heredity. And remember, heredity is just passing your traits from one generation to the next. All right. So in order to help, like the guy that kind of cracked the code with this, that gets the credit, is Gregor Mendel. He's known as the father of genetics. He was born in Austria in the 1800s. He became a monk, started playing around in the gardens, and he was really fascinated by pea plants. All right. So Mendel's experiments with peas were able to show that genes are discrete units that keep their separate identities when passed down from generation to generation. So we'll talk more about that as time goes on. So that's written in red, write that down. One of the reasons for the success of Mendel's experiments was he was able to be very careful. Being careful and being precise in scientific experiments is important. And of course, keeping good notes. So he was able to keep detailed notes and observed everything that he did. All right. He observed these pea plants, and there were 7 traits. So here is the definition for trait. So traits are distinguishable characteristics that can be inherited. And with Gregor Mendel, like Mendelian genetics, it's a very either you have it or you don't. So we talked about that with our trait tracker. Either you are a super taster or you are not. Are there exceptions? Of course. There's a lot more things than just a yes or a no, but there are some traits that are either you have it or you don't type of deal. All right, so scientists knew that traits were inheritable, right? People have been noticing that for a very long time, that kids look like their parents type of deal, but they didn't really know how. That's until Mendel kind of came along. So he was able to look at these pea plants and look at these traits, and he started to notice certain traits kind of overpowered other traits. And this is where we're going to talk about dominant versus recessive. So when you're doing your Punnett squares, which is what we're going to get into, it's extremely important that you pay attention to the words dominant and recessive. All right, so in genetics, we refer to mating 2 organisms as a cross. So we're going to cross these things. So Mendel noticed that when he crossed a purebred, and we'll talk about what that word means, white flower, with a purebred purple flower, the generation that they made looked like this. So we have our parental generation, that's known as our P generation. He crossed these guys, fertilized them, and then they produce the F1 generation, which is these right here. So notice how these flowers are both purple. Then he crossed these flowers and he got this. So we're looking at our F2 generation, and you can see that 3 out of the 4 flowers are purple and 1 of them is white. So how did this happen? So he figured out that traits were hidden when the parental purebred flowers, these guys up here, were crossed and reappeared in the F2 generation. So if you ever heard the term skipping a generation, that's what happened. Okay. So why is one example... this was one example of many patterns that he kind of noticed. And during his observations, he drew to some really important conclusions. So here are some important laws that you are going to need to know. And they are definitely laws that get easier when you actually see them in practice. Okay. So law of segregation. So the word segregate means to separate. So organisms have 2 copies of each gene. We talked about this, one from mom, one from dad. So genes, the definition for that, which you will need to know, are pieces of DNA that provide instruction to make a certain protein. And when we get into DNA replication and protein synthesis, you'll see how that happens. But for right now, I just need you to know that genes are pieces of DNA and they help code for certain traits. So genes determine your traits, your features, or characteristics that are passed down from you, or you can say they're inherited from your parents. Here is an example. We talked about meiosis. So organisms donate only one copy of their gene, right, from their gametes, their eggs or their sperm. So you get one set from mom, one set from dad, right? So here's an example. So Emma's mother, you can see that her gene, her trait for hair color is brown and red. Now, we don't know what she looks like, but I'm going to assume that because brown is a dominant trait, that she has brown hair. Now, that means that she can pass down the trait for red hair. It's in her DNA, so she can pass it down. Now, the father only has red hair. So if that's his trait, that's the only thing he can pass down. And we're going to find out what those words mean and what we can call them. So if randomly, because remember each egg is different, each sperm is different. So randomly, mom drops a red-haired egg and dad throws a red-haired sperm. You're going to get Emma, who's going to have red hair. Okay, so before we discuss the other laws, we need to understand some important principles. So we're not going to get to the other laws just yet. But we do need to know that there are different variations of genes called alleles. And this is important to know because I'm going to be using this word, so you need to know what it is. So different versions of a gene are called alleles, and we're going to represent that with capital and lowercase letters. All right. So we're going to use capital Y for yellow in terms of our pea plants and lowercase y for our green pea plants. So we can do A's to represent that. So a recessive trait is going to be a lowercase letter. Recessive is lowercase, and dominant is going to be uppercase. Stay with me, we're almost done. So the alleles that an organism receives from its parents, if they are the same, it can be homozygous. So remember our prefix homo means same. So you can see that both the alleles, both the letters are capital letters. Or they can be heterozygous, which means you have one capital and one lowercase. So just to make it abundantly clear, as long as your letters are the same, it can be homozygous. Now, this is important to know whether they're both capital or both lowercase. As long as they're the same, they're homozygous. And you have to pay extra special attention to this because if they're both capital versus both lowercase, it can give you a different result. So paying attention to your letters is very important, especially when we get to dihybrid crosses. All right, so genotype, very important word. You're going to hear it. You need to know it. Genotype refers to an organism's combination of alleles. So this is kind of what's in the DNA. So we have homozygous dominant, 2 capital letters. We have heterozygous, 1 capital, 1 lowercase. And we have homozygous recessive, so 2 lowercase letters. And this is important because this is what's going to get passed down. And in order to figure out what your physical characteristics are, you need to be aware of what your genotype is, what's in your DNA. So when we look at our physical characteristics or our traits of an individual, they're made up, it's called a phenotype. So phenotype is what you have the physicalness, what you are actually expressing. So I think of pheno, I think of physical, they both start with PH, they both have an F sound. I think of geno, I think of genes, I think of what's in my DNA. That's been working for me. If it doesn't work for you, you got to find your own way because you got to get these words down. I'm almost done, guys, I promise. As Mendel learned, one allele might be dominant over another. We're going to talk about non-Mendelian genetics later, but for right now, this is what I need you to know. A dominant allele is the allele that is expressed when 2 different alleles or 2 dominant alleles are present. Example. So we have homozygous dominant. This is why keeping track of those capital letters is so important. And heterozygous. So our phenotypes here, what I physically see, the color of the flamingo, is important. So if I have a purple flamingo and a pink flamingo cross and I get a pink flamingo, that means that my dominant trait, my dominant allele is pink. Ooh. Now, a recessive allele is the allele that is only expressed when you get two copies from the parent. And we'll go into detail more. This really requires practice to really get your foot in the door and understand it. So we have homozygous recessive, two little a's, and your recessive allele is expressed in two letters. So in order to phenotypically, physically express your recessive trait, you need two little letters. All right. So this is going to be our last slide because one, the bell's going to ring, and then two, we're going to work on Punnett squares together as a group, and I'll make a separate video for that. All right. An organism's genotype might be homozygous dominant, big T, or capital T, capital T. They could be heterozygous, which is big T, lowercase t, or big T, capital T, lowercase t, however you want to say it. And homozygous recessive is little t, or lowercase t, lowercase t. All right. I know that was a lot, guys, but it's unfortunately for genetics, it's a lot of terminology. So we are going to stop here for notes and we're going to pick up with Punnett squares when you guys are done with this set of notes. So I will see you all in class and we'll get to it.